Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world. This is Tim Collins, Secretary General of the ISSF. So welcome to our webinar this afternoon, Stainless Steel, your partner in hygiene. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody along. I will just run through a few housekeeping points first. So the presentation will be made available to everyone that is registered. So there's no need to ask a question to say, hey, will we get the presentation? Yes, you will. Furthermore, the presentation along with my commentary will be posted to YouTube after the event, so it's available to rewatch with the commentary. And then finally, for anybody who has questions, we would ask that you please pitch them via the chat function. And Joe Klaas from the ISSF, who's assisting me this afternoon, will look through those questions. Now, we may not have time at the end of the webinar to deal with all questions online. However, all questions that are not answered during the online session will be responded to by email. So nobody's question will get overlooked. So that's just to give people assurance. But also, if you have follow-up questions, you'll see my email at the bottom of the current opening screen. Please send an email as well and we'll answer additional questions after the event too. So without further ado, I will get going. So we have a fair number of topics on this afternoon's agenda. I'm not going to talk through them one by one. I'm sure you can read that and they'll be repeated as we get to the start of each section. Each section's fairly short in itself, so there's lots of sections, but each one is fairly brief. And then there'll be a quick summary at the end before opening the Q&A session. So we'll start first of all by looking at the material requirements for use in hygienic environments, and we're using the term hygienic in its broadest sense here. And really the material requirements can be boiled down to three relatively straightforward things. The first requirement is really that materials used in hygienic environments are both neutral and inert, and that is considered from a chemical, a bacteriological, and an organoleptic perspective. And organoleptic really is about the sort of impact on the senses. The material shouldn't impart tastes, smells, or anything to whatever it is interfacing with. And in the illustration here, we're using foods as a good example of that. And behind this requirement, there are a number of things to consider. Over quite many years, the awareness of people, whether it be in a professional capacity or in the public domain, on the impact of materials used in these sorts of applications has grown significantly. And that runs across three examples here: food and drinks manufacturing, and consumption, healthcare, and domestic applications. So we have a more knowledgeable population than we did several decades ago. But equally, it's fair to say that some materials are distrusted based on true scientific evidence. And whilst aluminium is a fantastic material, used in cooking, it has been clearly linked to the early onset of Alzheimer's disease, which is, something that's somewhat sad, but is understood now, which is another good point. However, stainless steels have been proven over just over 100 years now to have no adverse effects on human health, and their wide use and their lengthy use in many applications and usage sectors has been a very reassuring feature of this family of materials. So that's the first requirement to set the scene. Requirement two is that the material should be obviously hygienic, but cleanable as well. And what we mean by those two elements combined is that the appearance of the product is guaranteed time and time again. It doesn't deteriorate over time. But when we talk about hygienic and cleanable, we really mean that the elimination of both visible and invisible surface contamination is relatively easy to do. So it's about simple cleaning, but in a manner that guarantees destruction of microorganisms. And often the simple cleaning that people believe to be simple, maybe using just a straightforward soapy cleaner, does not destroy all microorganisms. So something more intense is needed, something that has disinfecting capabilities. And when we talk about disinfecting, we're talking about reducing the microbial population to a very, very low levels. And one of the benefits of stainless steels here is that because of the nature of their surface, which I'll talk about in a little while, these require lower concentrations of disinfectants to achieve the legal level of hygiene that's required, particularly when compared to other materials that have different surface topographies. So stainless steels, it's very clear to say, and clearly sort of based on evidence, are compatible with all satisfactory hygiene practices. Then now let's look at the third element, and this is about durability and resilience. So the requirement here is to ensure that the material that is used does not suffer from corrosion or what's known as surface aging. And surface aging is a better way perhaps described as aging oxidation. And an example of that people have probably seen on many occasions is the green patina that forms on copper. It is an aging type of oxidation. Now, we're not talking about creating aging oxidation features that look exactly like that, but that's an advanced form, but at least it gives an impression of the sort of thing that we need to avoid in these sorts of environments. So if that aging oxidation feature occurs, it suppresses any antibacterial or antiviral properties that the material may possess, and cleaning itself becomes a more difficult and intense task. Again, one of the benefits of stainless steels is that they have this invisible self-repairing passive film that resists corrosion and is highly adherent to the surface layer, which makes cleaning much more straightforward, cleaning and disinfectant. And on top of that, many different stainless steels exist that allows the users to select the optimal choice of material for the operating conditions and any corrosive environments that exist in those operating environments. So stainless, again, is a good fit against this notion of durability and resilience. So now we've set the scene with the prime requirements for materials in hygienic applications, and particularly stainless steels. What really do we understand about stainless steels? So here's a simple introduction. It's not meant to be in depth, and for people that are fairly unsure about stainless steels, it will provide a useful opening guide. So first of all, the history. Stainless steels were invented a little over 100 years ago, primarily in Sheffield, but also with German and American versions coming along at similar times. But it was steelworks metallurgist Harry Brearley who created the first patent for what was then called a rustless steel. And they're a family of steels containing a minimum of 10.5% chromium. There are 4 basic strands to the overall stainless steels family, and today we have somewhere over 100 different stainless steel grades available. It's not one thing, it's many things. They resist corrosion due to the presence of a passive layer, which I briefly mentioned. And this is a chromium oxide layer on the surface, which is self-repairing in the presence of oxygen. And it's possible to increase the corrosion resistance further by adding further alloying elements to the analysis. Molybdenum, as an example, provides great resistance against a feature known as pitting corrosion, which occurs in chloride or highly oxidizing environments. So having sort of set the scene, I'd like to talk about chromium, because from a corrosion resistance perspective, it's first and foremost, it's all about chromium. And on this graph here, you have the corrosion rate shown on the y-axis on the left, and you have the chromium content from 0 up to 20% in this case shown on the x-axis on the bottom. And the red line indicates the corrosion rate as the increase in chromium content moves upwards. So what you see that you have the carbon steels really to the left of this chart, they rust. You have the non-stainless steels in the midsection of the chart, they rust but at a slower rate. And then to the right of the black dotted line, you have stainless steels. This is the greater than 10.5% chromium content steels, and they resist corrosion, and almost you're at a flat line position across those higher chromium content products. So let's now look at the stainless steel families, and there are 4 groups, as I said. The martensitic group, and this is where it all started with Harry Brearley in 1913, and these are high strength, reasonable ductility products that have modest corrosion resistance. We wouldn't say good or excellent at this stage. Then you have the ferritic group. These have lower strengths but reasonable ductility and reasonable corrosion resistance, and they're resistant to a phenomenon known as stress corrosion cracking. And then we jump to the right of this, and this will become evident in a moment, with the austenitic group that most people are more familiar with, because you'll have come across terms like 18.8 stainless and 1810 stainless, and maybe 304 and 316 as grade designations. These products have a better strength, they're a highly formable product, they have good to excellent corrosion resistance depending on their alloy content, and they don't have a ductile to brittle transition as temperatures drop. So these are a very utility group of very much a utility group of stainless steels. But sitting in the middle are the new kid on the block, the duplex grades. I say new kid, they're still around 90 years old, but they're the newest family of stainless steels that combine the best of both. It's the best of the austenitics and the best of ferritics, really. So high strength grades, good to excellent corrosion resistance. They have good ductility. There is some transition, but it's suppressed. So good ductility down to minus 50 degrees centigrade, and good fatigue strength. So these are an excellent development of the stainless family, not understood by everybody yet, but form an important part of the stainless product range. So now let's try and put some of that in context using one example. And this example is pitting corrosion, which occurs when you have fluorides, chlorides, hydroxides, and other strong oxidizing agents present. And this chart shows the strength represented by the proof strength on the y-axis on the left-hand side, and what's known as the pitting resistance equivalent number, which is derived from the chemical analysis. It's described in a little box in the bottom left-hand corner. And basically, what you see here is carbon steel, which is shown as a comparative material, and this sits in the top left, so has good strength but weaker corrosion resistance. And I think we'd all understand that. We've seen rusty carbon steel throughout our lives. And then in the right-hand side, to the right of the red line, which is described as the basic chloride pitting resistance threshold, you have the duplex family of grades that combine both high strength and good to excellent corrosion resistance. And then in the middle section, either side of the red line, you have the ferritic, austenitic groups, and aluminium thrown in just for another comparative material reflection in there. But what becomes interesting when you look at this middle group is that the 316L grade is just to the right of that threshold line, and that's a grade containing molybdenum. So molybdenum is known to resist pitting corrosion, and this is a feature of the duplex grades as well. So some stainless steels do not perform as well against certain types of corrosive environments compared to others, and that's an important piece of understanding. So I just wanted to set that out using this slide for clarity. Now, I'd also, through this diagram, like to sort of compare material attributes, and this is a more subjective comparison, but I think is, from an illustrative perspective, rather helpful. So here we have three stainless families: austenitic, ferritic, and duplex, then carbon steel and aluminium to the right. And really, you've got a list of attributes. I'm not going to talk through them all down the left-hand side, and then a simple color coding system with green being good, yellow being acceptable, and red being poor. So you can see here quite quickly, and obviously if you want to choose one of these products, you then need to go into further investigative detail, but this gives an opening guide. So if you're looking for something that is highly hygienic and has good fire resistance, for example, you know where to focus your efforts. And this is a quick way of opening up the opportunities from a material selection perspective. So it's there as a reference guide, but does illustrate the differences across several attributes of these different materials. Okay, so having sort of just given a very quick introduction to stainless steels, I'll now talk about, well, what makes stainless steels fundamentally hygienic. So it really starts with the passive film. I've touched on this earlier in the slides, but I'll talk a little more now. So passive films are transparent. You can see through them. They're self-repairing in the presence of oxygen. They are highly adherent, and they're really, really thin, 2 to 3 nanometers thick. And you can see in the illustration there, you have the oxygen molecules in the air. You have the passive film firmly attached to the substrate material, in this case stainless steel. And even if you take some instrument to that, like an axe, and damage the passive layer, it soon replaces itself automatically. So removal of it temporarily, it just allows the passive film to rebuild in the presence of oxygen. The alternative is a barrier layer, some kind of coating, whether it be chemical coating or painted coatings or whatever. And these layers tend to be opaque. They're not self-repairing. They do suffer from what's known as adherence decay. They come off over time. They tend to be quite thick, 20,000 nanometers or thicker. And they are more problematic in that they loosen and fail to adhere over time. They harbor viruses and bacteria unless you choose something quite expensive. And this clearly presents more cleaning challenges. They tend to be porous to some degree, whereas the passive film is generally not porous. So if we put the comparative differences side by side, you can see that passive films or passive layers, however you term them, are an inherent part of the material. They're invisible and thin, highly adherent, not really porous, highly wear and damage resistant. They self-repair if damaged, really easy to clean. They do not harbor bacteria, and they do not allow viruses to survive. And that survival is reduced with regular cleaning too. And I'll come on to that a little later. By contrast, barrier layers, you have to spend money to put them in there, put them on there in the first place. They're visible and thick. They have weaker adherence to the substrate material. They tend to be porous unless they're highly bespoke. They offer limited wear and damage resistance. They need repairing if damaged, because from a hygiene perspective, it opens you up to all sorts of challenges. Cleaning itself, if it's reasonably aggressive, can loosen those layers, and they're known to harbor both bacteria and viruses. So in simple terms, I'd say it's a thumbs up for passive film and a thumbs down for barrier layers. But what are the hygienic benefits? So we know the passive film now is self-repairing in the presence of oxygen. We know it's highly adherent. That's been described already. But one of the strengths of stainless steels is they can be hygienically cleaned with simple disinfectant products. And cleaning twice a day will accelerate resistance to both surface bacterial and virus longevity and infectability. And we need to recognize that detectability of viruses and infectability are two very different things. Stainless steels themselves are exceptionally wear resistant. Their surfaces are really smooth, so that makes it difficult for germs and bacteria to both adhere and to multiply. And viruses do not survive too long. And the half-life of a virus on stainless steel surfaces is just a few hours. It's longer than some other materials like copper, for sure, but with regular cleaning, the virus half-life reduces to minutes in quite a quick period of time. So I would advocate twice daily cleaning will then reduce your virus half-life to under 30 minutes, which is quite impressive. And that gets better over time, as I've said. Now, if we move on, sort of saying we've described why stainless steels are fundamentally hygienic, let's look at 3 different application sectors, and we'll start with food and drinks preparation. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about regulation. And in Europe, the framework of regulation, EC 1935-2004, requires food contact materials to be safe. And what we mean by safe is that they must not transfer their constituents to the food in quantities that could endanger human health or change the food composition in an unacceptable way or deteriorate its taste or odor. So this starts to bring together those 3 features that I talked about in the opening of this presentation. And the Council of Europe produced new guidelines in 2013, so not that long ago. And within that, there were defined specific release limits for the constituent elements of materials, which in the case of stainless steels, we'd look primarily at iron, chromium, and nickel. There are other materials, but I'm going to use these as illustrative from a sort of description perspective of what contents or what levels are released. But also in this new guideline was a new testing protocol using a solution of citric acid as a food stimulant, and that replaced, from a corrosion perspective, acetic acid that had been used previously, and citric acid is more aggressive. So this was seen as a tougher test. Now, in 2014, an independent study was carried out to look at the continuing safety of using stainless steel in food preparation. And that was undertaken by the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. And they followed the outline, the regulation of the COE testing criteria that was imposed across Europe. And they looked at the defined specific release limits, which I'll describe shortly on the next slide, for metals and alloys, including the new, more aggressive test using citric acid, as I've mentioned. And we were essentially saying we had a pH of 2.4 using 5 grams of citric acid per litre of liquid. And this reflected what was commonly present in both acidic and alkalinic foods. And the first part of the test, there were several parts to the test, but the first part, which I'll illustrate, was based on exposure of the material to this aggressive test over 2 hours at 70 degrees centigrade. So I'll describe the findings and then show them in a chart. So from the findings, none of the constituent alloying elements of stainless steels were released in any amounts exceeding or coming close to the corresponding release limits. And that was as stipulated in the protocol. And what was interesting is that as time progressed, particularly beyond the first 2 hours of measurement time, the metal release rates actually decreased. And that was observed to be due to a gradually improved passivation of the stainless steel surfaces. So the passive layer actually became more resistant to metal release as time progressed, and therefore the released metals actually diminished over time. Now, it's important to note that the limited release of the constituent alloying elements is controlled by both the passive film present on the surface, but also the alloying or matrix effect, which firmly sequesters those alloying elements within the atomic matrix. And other forms of test to simulate how these materials behave when exposed to gastric juices that were carried out by the European Scientific Advisory Council verified this same sort of outcome. So it showed that the metals are only released in very low levels. And I'd now like to illustrate that with the findings for 3 metal constituents: iron, chromium and nickel. There are 7 different stainless steel grades that were in the study. 2 of them, the first 2, the ferritic grades, had effectively 0 nickel, so could not be assessed against the nickel release component. But what you will see, looking at the bottom particularly, the specific release limits of 40 micrograms for iron, 0.25 micrograms for chromium and 0.14 micrograms for nickel, and this is all micrograms per centimetre squared, were not even, the release rates didn't actually come close in that first 2-hour period, and as I've said, diminished thereafter. So everything here was a comfortable green tick in effect against this tougher test that had been brought in 2013. So I think that gives us comfort that stainless steels are a very good hygienic material that don't have an impact on food or drinks preparation. So in summary, it's safe to say that beyond having the long, safe and trusted history as a contact material for food and drinks, that's within professional environments and also within the home, stainless steels are inert and offer a very long service life that is essentially maintenance free. Regular cleaning and where appropriate disinfection is important, but beyond that, not much is needed. As a material group, they're fully compliant with all the current global regulations for food contact material, and the passive layer and the alloying effect ensures that constituent metal releases are well below those regulatory thresholds. And that's applicable all over the world. I use the European data for illustration, but it doesn't change wherever you are. So now let's move forward and consider the demands of healthcare. So healthcare related infections are driven really by 2 things, both material choices and cleaning and disinfection regimes. And it's important to consider these side by side or hand in hand. So good cleaning and disinfection regimes are absolutely critical in healthcare, and that applies to all material surfaces, whether it's instruments used in healthcare, touch surfaces, implants, room walls, anything. And what's important here, and I touched on this earlier, is the surface topography of the material. It's a critical feature because the surfaces need to be favourable to thorough and easy cleaning. And what we mean by that is complete removal of microorganisms and associated biofilms that support the growth of those microorganisms. And equally, over time, that surface topography must not deteriorate. Furthermore, the surfaces must be both wear and impact resistant, because wear damage and impact damage actually supports bacterial and virus longevity in many materials. So that's an additional feature on top of the surface topography. Now, from a study that was carried out back in 2017, this shows the efficiency of disinfection of stainless steels against the MRSA bacteria, which we know is problematic from time to time. And what we have here in this chart is 2 different stainless grades, a 304 type, which is an 18 chromium, 8% nickel or 10% nickel steel, and a 316 grade, which is similar variant but with added molybdenum. And we have 4 different surface finishes: the cold rolled slightly reflective finish, the cold rolled satin polished finish, the cold rolled bright annealed finish, where the steel is heat treated in a oxygen free environment to retain the bright cold roll finish, so it doesn't need re-rolling to brighten up the finish, and then an abrasive brushed finish. And then we have 2 sort of categories of stainless: brand new stainless at the moment of installation, and aged stainless some years down the line, been in service for some time. And what's impressive is that the biocide efficiency is close to 100% for all these materials, and the aged performance is no different to the new performance. So this is a method of verifying that stainless steel throughout its operating life is still disinfectable to a very high degree of efficiency. So this is a really good test that demonstrates that the material is suitable for healthcare applications. Now, we know about alternative materials in these situations, and they are used, but it's fair to say they have some challenges as well. So antimicrobial surfaces are not effective against all microorganisms, which presents a challenge, and antibacterial efficiency of these materials is frequently overstated, and the assessment method for looking at the effectiveness does not identify dormant cells which can become live at some point in the future. So it's not without some challenges, even though there are some positives to antimicrobial surfaces. Similarly, silver-containing coatings, which are initially very effective, and you would argue better than stainless steels at the start, do wear off easily. So you've not only got a high cost to pay for these sorts of products, but you've got the challenge that wear brings over time, and the imperfections that result from surface wear harbour bacteria and viruses. And with silver containing coatings, you have no visible indicators when the antimicrobial effect begins to fail. So again, some challenges because the problems are not visible. And then last week, we come to copper and its alloys in this sort of trilogy of alternative materials. Copper is expensive. It is not a cheap material. It's less wear resistant when compared to other materials. However, it does rely on the release of copper 2+ ions, which at the start is fantastic and copper is really effective. But also the release of these ions makes microorganisms copper resistant. So in other words, the release of the copper ions and their effect actually diminishes, because you get diminishment resulting from the surface oxidation effect, which copper and its alloys are sort of is a feature of how they behave. But also the buildup of copper resistant microorganisms means that the copper ions that are released become less effective as well. So there's a double whammy there, which is not so helpful, even though the material is fantastic at the start. So to summarize from a healthcare perspective, stainless steels are really easy to clean and sanitize, even after decades of use. Less cleaning materials are required compared to other surfaces, particularly those that are more susceptible to damage and or less sort of smooth and hard. The topography of stainless steel is really favorable for cleaning, and the non-porous passive layer assists in that process. Stainless steels are completely inert, so they don't support the notion of resistant forming microorganisms, and that's, you know, other materials are known to do that. Stainless steels are both wear and damage resistant, and the passive film reforms in the case of damage, and both sort of critical or widely used sterilizing techniques, either chemical or thermal techniques, can be used on stainless steels with no ill effects. So a good all-round performance, although I must stress cleaning and sanitizing is an important part of working with stainless steels. So now in the final element of our trilogy of sort of use of stainless steels in hygienic type applications, we'll look at the public environment. And I'm sure you've all seen in the public environment, stainless steels are all over the place, whether it be doors, door furniture, handrails and barriers, restrooms, seats and benches, things to do with moving people around, elevators, escalators, etc. Building facades and structural cladding are popular in stainless, and equally decorative features, whether that be inside or outside buildings. So stainless steels are becoming commonplace in the public environment. But why would you choose stainless steels for these applications? We know they're hygienic now. Well, what else is important? So being easy to clean, which we've talked about, being inert, so that there's no impact on people touching and picking up viruses or bacteria from these surfaces. They'll last for over 100 years without any routine maintenance when correctly specified. And their attractive appearance does not change over time. So they will look, as long as they're appropriately specified, just as good on day 1000 as they looked on day 1. And they can be fully recycled at the end of life with no real concerns, no loss of attributes, etc. But there are some specific pieces of guidance needed when thinking about stainless steels in these sorts of applications. And I'm going to illustrate 2 of them now. So the first one is something called crevice corrosion is not understood. And that's because people don't actually perceive a crevice in the true sense. A crevice is a confined space. What we're talking about here is gaps in and contact areas between material parts. And the photograph to the right shows a stainless material that is fitted with a stainless bolt with a washer inserted between the nut head and the bolt, which you can't see. And you've created a crevice between the washer and the stainless steel product that's been fitted to something. And in what happens here is that moisture gets between the washer and the surface of the material, and it leads to an electrochemical reaction occurring in that crevice. And then the metal faces in the crevice, both the washer and the substrate material below that, undergo uniform corrosion. And there are simple things you can do to avoid this, but it's often not understood. And I'm sure many people have seen examples where you think, hey, that looks a bit poor when it's supposed to be stainless steel. But it's because people don't understand about crevice corrosion and how it occurs and what a crevice actually is. So what do we do to prevent this? Well, the first thing is choose the right stainless steel. Choose a suitably corrosion resistant stainless steel for the application. Furthermore, it's important to design to minimize joints that use, as in this example here, visible fixings. The more you can do away from them, the more you eliminate crevices. Regular cleaning of installations will remove deposits, because the deposits are part of the process here. So deposits, fine particles get into these crevices, but also design the installation for complete drainage, because you know, just simple condensation will start to cause a problem in this situation, because it will drag deposits into those crevices. So it's important that these things are understood and designed out. The second example is that something called galvanic corrosion is not recognized. And there's 2 photographs here that show galvanic corrosion in action. One is the use of 2 different types of nuts on a bolt, one compatible with the material of the nut and one not, which is corroded. And on the lower photograph, a non-stainless washer has been applied to a bolt and some kind of fitting there. And what you see is the washer is corroded. And galvanic corrosion is described as corrosion that occurs when 2 metals or alloys that have very different galvanic potentials are in contact. And they then become connected by a conducting liquid, an electrolyte, which includes humidity. And then what's known as the least noble metal or alloy is attacked, and we can see that in the pictures, and it corrodes. So how do you avoid this? Well, avoiding having dissimilar metals in contact with one another is the obvious starting point. So never use carbon steel fixings for a stainless steel product. So in other words, don't have the carbon steel washer as shown in the bottom photograph. Always use a stainless steel washer, and then you get rid of the dissimilar metals problem. And then avoid products with metal or alloy coatings, because when you tighten these things up, you're likely to damage those coatings. An example of that is galvanized coatings. Once you start applying pressure and force to a galvanic coating, you will start to damage it, and then you will promote galvanic corrosion, because you have 2 dissimilar metals which will create the galvanic corrosion principle. So these are just 2 illustrative guides to say, hey, these are things that need to be thought about. And there are many examples of where these things have not been thought about. So in terms of the public environment summary, what I'd like to say is stainless steels are without a doubt a wonderful material for public installations, and we're seeing more and more of them. Their hygienic characteristics are supreme, we know that already, and they're relatively easy to keep clean, and they're essentially maintenance free when designed and specified correctly, and that's the critical part. But their sustainable credentials are probably the best of all man-made materials. They're fully and infinitely recyclable with no loss of attributes. They have very low production and life cycle emissions footprint, and it's the life cycle emissions footprint that's important. And their life cycle costs are generally somewhere around 20% lower than other possible material choices. And that's because they don't attract attention and maintenance and replacement and titivation, as I would say, over their operational life. Now, I'd like to sort of move on as we get towards the end of this webinar to look at two further aspects. One is cleaning stainless steels, and stainless steels are easy to clean and disinfect. There are a few key rules that we need to know about, and there's a few things to avoid. So we'll start with cleaning materials. Generally, you should clean stainless steels with soft sponges and microfiber cloths. That's the primary choice. It is possible to use stainless steel scouring pads, but with care, because you have a high risk of developing surface scratch marks. But used with care, they'll be effective. But what about cleaning products? So here's a number of illustrations for different situations. So for greasy marks, soapy water that's about hand hot will remove those greasy marks quite effectively. For lime scale diluted vinegar, if you've got a 7% acetic acid vinegar dilution of 25 to 50% will dissolve lime scale quite effectively. If you're working with tea stains or similar residues, boiling water and sodium carbonate will work, allowing 10 to 15 minutes for that solution to be effective. And if it's coffee deposits, then you need boiling water and baking soda. Similar amount of time, about 15 minutes for the solution to work effectively. And then at the bottom, we have three cleaning approaches that require the use of gloves, hence the yellow hand symbol. So alcoholic solvents, acetone will remove adhesive residues quite effectively. Mild disinfectants in hot water are also highly effective, both from a sort of removal of residue, but a disinfection perspective if that's what you need. And diluted bleach may be used, but with care, recognizing there is a small risk of corrosion here, so you need to thoroughly rinse the surfaces afterwards. But there are some things to avoid. So concentrated bleaches, worth avoiding because they're likely to promote pitting corrosion, which I talked about earlier in this webinar. Salt sore cleaning products containing chlorides that are known to contain chlorides, they'll also promote pitting corrosion. Hard abrasive scourers will leave scratch marks on the surface, and that's unattractive, so not desired. Then a couple of things that are real, you must avoid these at all costs. Wire wool iron scouring pads are really unsuitable. Not only will they scratch the surface, they'll destroy the passive layer and promote corrosion because the passive layer will be contaminated by the iron and cannot reform. And silver dip cleaners are equally unsuitable because of they contain usually strong acids and chlorides. So again, start to damage the passive layer. So these are the things to walk away from. Don't use these, please. Now, I'd like to sort of wrap up before we get to the quick summary with just a look at some common misunderstandings and pitfalls. So there's 4 common misunderstandings. Stainless steels are expensive, so I'm not going to choose them because they're just too expensive. Well, yes, their upfront costs are higher, but life cycle costs are really much, much lower. So I think we have to look, because when you're choosing stainless steels, you should be choosing for a maintenance-free life and a need to not replace on a regular basis or not maintain. So I would say that's a red cross. That's wrong. All stainless steels behave in the same way. Given that we have more than 100 different stainless steels available today, and they're all designed for different applications and different operating conditions, they don't all behave in the same way. There are similar features about them, but it's about choosing the right product for the right application. And that's where we can assist, and producers of stainless steel can assist in choice of appropriate grade. So again, a red cross. Stainless steels do not rust or corrode. Well, unfortunately, if you specify the wrong type of stainless steel, it has a high chance of corroding in the operating environment. So you have to match the grade to the operating environment to avoid corrosion. And corrosion of stainless steels can be prevented. It's all about understanding your operating environment. And then lastly, using non-stainless fixings and fasteners is okay when you're working with stainless steels. I would say this is like offering garlic to a vampire. This is really a bad thing to do. And an example I saw some years ago was a gentleman's urinal that had fallen off the wall 6 months after being installed using carbon steel fixings. And that's just an indication of how quickly things can deteriorate when you get galvanic corrosion occurring. So another red cross. The second part of this, I'd like to sort of look at misunderstandings associated with healthcare, because this is particularly important. And healthcare related infections and associated specifically with multiple resistant microorganisms are determined by factors other than just material selection. Whilst material selection is important, you have to consider several other things. And there's a number of things here looking at 4 materials side by side: the antimicrobial surfaces, silver containing coatings, copper and its alloys, and stainless steels. Now, for these materials, if you look at their initial effectiveness, none of them are bad. Antimicrobial surfaces, because the performance is variable, would be classed maybe as reasonable. Everything else starts good. But then later effectiveness deteriorates for some of these products. Antimicrobial surfaces probably not, because they're not starting top of the pops, so to speak. But silver coatings become poor because they're softer and wear away, and copper fades to only reasonable because the release of copper ions diminishes over time, whereas stainless stays good all the time. Still remembering that you have to keep it clean. But then when you think about life cycle costs and wear resistance, other things that are important in the sort of healthcare environment, the life cycle cost of stainless becomes really good because you don't have to replace it. It will last for a long, long time, even through multiple thermal sterilizations or whatever. And the wear resistance of stainless remains very good, whereas the other things are less good from these perspectives. So we have to put things in context side by side to do comparisons, and it's all about comparisons over time. What's good on day one is not necessarily good on day 101. So to wrap up, in summary, stainless steels play a significant role in sustaining this high level of hygiene in our society. And it's not by chance that many of the sort of serious illnesses caused by poor hygiene factors have pretty much diminished in large parts of our world. The notion of the passive layer is one of the key things that helps stainless in providing this performance, because it's non-porous and self-repairing, and this gives this unrivaled anti-corrosion protection. They have a series of stunning attributes to stainless steels, which are heavily relied on in many sectors, whether it be healthcare, pharmaceuticals, food and drinks preparation, and public spaces. And those attributes remain consistent over time, over a long time. They are easy to clean. It's a few simple rules, and follow those rules and you have no problems. And when you specify the right stainless steel grade for the right environment, they offer maintenance-free operation, which doesn't diminish again over time. So I would argue that stainless steels for hygienic applications are a true partner in avoiding difficulties, challenges, and other problems that these types of applications need, and they serve our society well. So at that point, I'd like to end my presentation and open the floor to questions. Joe.
Thank you, Tim. No questions so far. So there's another question. Now there's a question coming in.
Okay.
What is the most used grade?
Well, that's an interesting question, because if you look just from a simple perspective, the 304 grade is probably the most used grade across all applications. However, when you start to consider specific issues, so let's take pharmaceutical manufacturing as an interesting case in point, then the pharmaceutical industry will tend to prefer to use 316L stainless. So this is an austenitic grade with chromium, nickel and molybdenum to avoid pitting corrosion, to get that guaranteed corrosion resistance year in, year out without any maintenance. And equally, if you're thinking about urban environments, particularly coastal environments where you have saltwater sprays from the sea, you would definitely want to have a molybdenum bearing stainless steel as your primary choice of material. So whilst there is the 304 grade that is probably the most used stainless all over the world, you have to think about your environment and your application when choosing the grade. So most used is interesting, but it needs to be kept in context.
Thank you, Tim. No further questions have come in. Should we wait for one more minute so people have time to type?
Well, people have time to type. One of the things I would say is there's a few appendices attached to this presentation, which everybody, of course, will get. But one of the ones that's quite interesting from an illustrative perspective is the galvanic series of metals and alloys. And this is a good reference diagram. And what this shows to the left is the materials that are described as the most noble. These are the things that will resist corrosion when coupled to something on the right. So if you look at what's on the right, fourth in from the right hand side is carbon steel. When that is coupled to a stainless steel, and all the stainless steels are to the left of carbon steel, using this data, you can see that things to the right will corrode preferentially when coupled to something else. So the notion of using a carbon steel washer or a carbon steel nut interfaced with a piece of stainless steel, the carbon steel will corrode. And this is a very simple guide and provides really good material guidance or material selection guidance when you're thinking about constructing things and fixing things.
Yeah. No more questions have come in, so I think it was all pretty clear.
Okay, which is always good. But as I've said at the start, if people have questions that pop into their minds later, then please don't hesitate. Throw the questions at me. You'll have my email address if you've not noted it down when you receive the presentation. So I was just about to say our next webinar comes up at the end of March, on the 31st of March, when we're talking about the notion of everlasting things in stainless steels, and we're particularly focusing on stainless steel bottles and food boxes and refillable containers for toiletries and cosmetics. And this will be an interesting webinar because it really will challenge our preconceptions about how we should think about choosing materials and protecting our planet. So if people want to sign up for that, then please register your interest as well in due course. But thank you very much for your attention. Take care, stay safe, and hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.